Thanks a lot. And thank you very much to the Center for inviting the World Bank to be present at this important workshop. I guess we have all the key stakeholders present in this room, which is very, very, very good to know. And of course, we have a esteemed finance panel, and I will try to do my best to cover a few points. Whatever I'm going to speak today, of course, is based on a lot of experience from other colleagues in the World Bank. I have worked on a few of these projects, but not all of them, quite frankly. So if you do have any questions which I am not able to answer, I will try to get back to you on them. And I also would like to thank the organizers for making financing not the very last session. Usually, we come at the very end in every conference and every workshop. So it's good to know that there is one more session to go after this. If we can click on the, okay, so this graph actually comes from one of our reports, which we had done a couple of years ago. One of my colleagues based in Beijing office is responsible for this. I like this graph particularly because if you look at it, basically the McKinsey cost curve approach, energy efficiency should be very easy to do. But of course, sorry, the access to finance and availability of finance continues to be the major barrier. And so you really need, even if we call it the first fuel, which we do based on its inexpensive cost compared to even renewables and fossil fuel, of course, it is challenging to deploy these technologies. And you do need financing, but also you need access to financing. There's a difference between financing and access to financing. There's a lot of countries where a lot of money is around, but energy efficiency projects are not getting that money. How do you make it possible? But then there are countries where there is no money at all. So you have to have, therefore, policy and financing mechanisms to come into play to make this market transformation. Shall we go to the next one? I can do this from this side. Okay, good. So this is really borrowed from SE4ALL. And I think in the morning, one of the speakers did mention the gap, the huge gap which exists if you look at the 2 degrees Celsius target, which is quite challenging. Even if you look at the INDCs, which Mel had presented, it is not possible to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius with INDCs, which have been submitted by the 155 countries. But if you add the 450 ppm scenario on top of that, then you need to invest a lot of money. Today's investment is nowhere close to that amount. Combine the public sector, World Bank, IADB, and whatnot, all the banks together, and even the private sector investment, if you add up, it's nowhere close to the investment which is required to achieve that 2 degrees Celsius. So it is a big challenge. Okay. This is the one, right? Okay. Again, IEA and our SE4ALL, and I used to be in the global tracking framework team of SE4ALL a couple of years ago, and that is really my interest in this forum, of course. And there we found that to achieve this target, a lot of actions need to take place. Actions would have to be a lot in the developing world, as this graph shows, and in the sectors which we hardly touched here, transport sector. I'm glad that in the previous session somebody talked about transport, because that is one of the key sectors which I bet many of us are not very familiar with. Most of the audience I see here are more familiar with electricity. Of course, electrical energy savings and thermal savings are important, but transport sector has to be tackled also if you have to really achieve this 2 degrees Celsius target. So this is, again, a summary of what the gaps are. Looking at the second bullet, you need $500 to $600 billion per year, every year, from now until 2030 to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius or the 450 ppm target. Current investments, nowhere close to that. It's 150 billion. Even if you add the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, the CTF, World Bank, IFC, ADB, AFDB, IADB, all that is $50 to $60 billion in the energy efficiency area. So that leaves a gap of $400 billion per year. Now, here is a challenge. and which a lot of us do not acknowledge, but I think this forum has acknowledged, is that the role of the private sector. You have to bring in the private sector investment to make this happen. 80% of the investment required to achieve this target, this number which we are seeking, has to come from the private sector. And so the idea is, how do we use our public money to de-risk these private investments, to make the private investment environment even better, so that more and more private investors pump in money to achieve energy efficiency goals. Technology is not a challenge, quite frankly. Technologies are there, but they're not being delivered. The other thing which is happening is that a lot of emphasis is now shifting from countries to cities. Urbanization is taking place. And oftentimes in our scheme of things, we have noticed that financing sometimes is more important when you go down to the city level and intervene at the city level. And I think a lot of trend has started changing. You see more and more donors, more and more development partners are getting into city level actions and city level instruments rather than at the national level. Okay, so here is really my sort of the key slide of my presentation. Again, this came out of one of our reports which we did last year and we updated this year. When you think about the range of countries around the world, you have colleagues from Rwanda, Uganda, and I have worked in Uganda and Rwanda both, and you compare countries from where I come from India, and where I've worked also in China, there's a huge difference in two things. One is the markets. The markets in many of these countries are far more developed than many of the other developing countries. The second is the banking sector. The banking sector, as they say in many of these big five developing countries, are almost the same as the US and the West. Whereas if you go down to many of these other countries in the Pacific Islands, for instance, the banking sector doesn't work that well. So keeping those two environmental or the market constraints in mind, we do have to think about a range of instruments. What do we do with the public money? If you look at we call this a public financing ladder. If you look at the left-hand sort of the vertical public financing ladder from bottom to top, you really go from grants to subsidies to working with electric utilities to public super ESCOs. Then you go down to banking instruments. You work with local banks, set up credit lines, as the previous speaker, Florence, was talking about credit lines in some countries. Then you go down to risk-sharing facilities, which is even more sophisticated in financing terms. And then you slowly go down to venture capital. And then the private sector takes over. So I think depending upon where we are, one has to intervene with the right kind of instrument in that particular context. So very quickly, a few examples of how this works. So in the previous one, I had shown you that one of the mechanisms would be setting up a simple EE fund. You do that in many countries where the banking sector is reasonably good, but they haven't ventured into energy efficiency. So you go and set up an energy efficiency fund to demonstrate to the banks that energy efficiency is a viable, commercially viable option. And again, this diagram is very simple. Basically, you set up a dedicated agency, dedicated fund, which either lends to the end user or to the ESCOs, but basically for doing efficiency projects. We in the World Bank have done a series of energy efficiency funds for the last 20 years. This is a list across the globe. We have more recently, right now, I don't know whether anybody from Armenia is there, but my colleague in the bank is managing this fund, the Armenia R2E2 fund. Again, it's a dedicated entity which lends to energy service companies, to municipalities, to do energy efficiency projects. And there's a leverage component in there also. Then you come down to another instrument which I showed in the public financing ladder called the utility demand side management, where you work with electric utilities. Why? Because every country you come from has an electricity company. I was talking to my colleagues from Uganda. So in 2006 or 7, when Uganda was facing this real severe power crisis, they wanted the World Bank to help. And the help was simply making sure that you overcome the peak load, which was not being met, by introducing efficient light bulbs. Those days it was CFLs. Who did we work with? We worked with the electric company. ESCOM run Ugandan utility was our partner. So you do utility demand side management. And again, there's a series of examples from 10 years ago, even from now, where you actually work with the utility. Because why? Because the utility is an established entity. You don't sometimes want to recreate and create a new institution. Creating a new institution is another level of challenge. You work with an institution which knows how to procure, which knows how to do their financing, which knows how to borrow and return to the banks, because they do that for power stations, right? So you can convince them more easily if there is a shortage situation. So I'm going to skip very quickly. Actually, I showed this slide to some of my colleagues with whom I was there in Paris last week at another UNEP event. We had a similar utility DSM project in Mexico. So this is a slide about that, where 25 million light bulb, 45 million CFLs were distributed with financing coming from the World Bank, GEF, CTF, all kinds of CDM. Compared to, of course, Uganda, this was a much larger, bigger program. I wanted to show you this India program, which is going on right now, although, quite frankly, we have been very indirectly associated with it. EESL, which is the so-called super ESCO in India, Energy Efficiency Services Limited, has managed to distribute 25 million LED light bulbs to consumers, and has a target of 770 million to be replaced over the next 3 years. And that is going to save a lot of megawatts and kilowatt hours, as you can see in the bullets. And the consumer savings are enormous at the same time. Now, look at the graph. The power of bulk procurement, and I have borrowed this from one of my colleagues in EESL. I actually texted him and saying that, can I use his slide to show what you guys are doing? And look at the power of bulk procurement by the utility, where the LED, it's a high quality LED with 3-year warranty. The price of that has come down to $1.10 in the market. I mean, to the bulk procurement. And what the government is doing, the utility is going out and distributing these LEDs, just charging 10 rupees, which is like 15 cents, and the balance in installments. So I think this is the power of utility-based bulk procurement, or utility DSM. Now there is a dashboard which I want to click, and if Iris can help do that, look at this. This is the so-called Delp utility dashboard. Look at the number on the top. It's in the Indian sort of system of currency, but it's 25 million. So 25 million lamps have been distributed and replaced. And if you wait for 10 seconds, you will see the number will change. Why? Because it's actually it's nighttime in India already. But if it was daytime, you will see the number changing very quickly. People are exchanging light bulbs or coming to the store and collecting these lights. And as soon as they do that with the electricity bill, the number is getting updated. And this is a nationally run program. You can see those states of India where these numbers, smaller numbers are shown. If you happen to click on each of those numbers, you will actually know where to go and do this. For example, if you click on Delhi, the Delhi number, which is, no, but that's a state of Uttar Pradesh, but that's okay. So those are the various cities within the state of Uttar Pradesh. And if you go down to each city, it'll give you the list of centers where you can go and buy these lamps at only 15 cents per customer by showing the electricity bill, the utility bill, and it works. So those are the list of centers, those are the addresses. So this is another form of utility demand side management. Let's go back to the slides now, I think. I'll take 5 more minutes and I will be done. So I'm not, let's go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. So I don't want to go over the credit line business because I think Florence did cover it in her presentation for the AFDB. Basically setting up a dedicated financing with an existing institution. Again, you need to have good banking system where you can set up credit lines. That's the requirement. We have, again, lots of experience with credit lines. China is one of our shining examples of a successful credit line. And that list, it's hard to read, but we'll give you names of countries and the amount of money which was set up. We used to set up those credit lines. China example, basically, we gave 400 million over a series of 3 credit lines, one after the other, which leveraged $1.5 billion of private sector and Chinese money. It simply went to projects, which was for energy efficiency. The challenge here is you have to find banks which are able to handle this. It took us 3 to 4 years just to train those banks to accept energy efficiency as a line of business. That's the challenge. So here are the details, what I explained just now. The other important thing is technical assistance. You need to think about technical assistance along with the money which you're giving. Because again, even the Chinese banks were not up to speed to do energy efficiency those days. So if you think about a developing country where the banking sector is very, very new and nascent, you obviously need to put in a lot more technical assistance to make this happen. So here is the last one, what we call the risk-sharing facility. And I know Corinne is going to talk about her probably chewy risk-sharing facility in China, but I'm going to talk about my India risk-sharing facility. So the India risk-sharing facility, which is actually my project, which I set up last year, was basically for helping ESCOs do lending to, or do projects in the street lighting, small and medium scale industry and industry sector and building sector. So these ESCOs, I'll show you the next graph. Basically, the money from the World Bank, which is basically CTF and GF money blended, goes into a local bank, which is giving out a risk-sharing guarantee to banks in India, which are going to lend to ESCOs. So banks in India, again, here is the issue of difference between access to money and availability of money. In India, availability of money is not the issue. Banks have lots of money. They're not giving it to ESCOs. How do you make that happen? So you make that happen by guaranteeing that lending. So this is the facility which is really basically guaranteeing and sharing the risk of that lending. And this is all private sector, so it's a leverage of private sector, and we are hoping that within the next couple of years, we'll have over $150 million of lending in buildings, street lighting, SME, through ESCOs. Okay, and that's the end of this presentation, but again, giving this big picture, I want to tell you that choosing what instrument you will use is where I think we come in. In our assessment, I mean, I'm not a finance expert, quite frankly, I'm an engineer. So our assessment in these countries is to see what kind of instrument would be perfect in what time of their development phase, depending upon the circumstances of their market and the financing sector and the potential, of course. So that really, that graph, that last page really shows that one has to be very careful about selecting an instrument. I've often heard saying that, ESCOs are the panacea. No, ESCOs are not the solution everywhere. So we have learned it over and over again. It's not the solution, everywhere. So, or it's not the solution at every point of time. It depends upon the market readiness, whether or not the ESCOs can operate or not. So the other thing, this is the very last slide, I promise, is to show that along with financing, again, financing itself is not the panacea. Along with financing, you need a lot of other things going on at the same time. Institutions are very important. In China, we were able to do a lot in the efficiency area, helping set up the ESCO industry by actually investing a lot on the institutional dimension. In India, EESL, you saw this fantastic dashboard with numbers changing. It's an institution behind it, which has made it happen. The super ESCO in India, which has made it happen. So, and of course, you need the right policies and the pricing. And so these circles are essential for delivering efficiency, in addition to the financing. I think that's my very last slide, but I will do some publicity saying that we are organizing a conference on December 17th or 18th in India on efficient lighting, along with that particular entity which I showed, the numbers changing. So if anyone of you are interested in participating, coming over, just let me know. We'll put you on the list and tell the ESL people to invite you formally. I know several of you here are already coming, and they have already agreed to come. Thank you very much.